The words landed in the middle of my perfectly ordered living room like stones thrown through a stained glass window, shattering a lifetime of carefully constructed peace. "I can't stand you, Marjorie," Jasmine said, her voice not loud, but low and vibrating with a terrifying finality. "I cannot stand the way you look at him, the way you talk to him, the way you breathe the same air as him. It's like you're a vine, and you've been choking the life out of him for 30 years. And you've been choking me for the 5 years I've been married to him. I'm done. I'm done trying to prune you back. I'm cutting myself free." She didn't look at me as she said it. Her eyes were fixed on my son, her husband, David. He stood there, frozen, a statue of a man caught between the woman who gave him life and the woman who was supposed to share it with him. The silence that followed her declaration was a vacuum, sucking all the warmth and familiarity from the room, leaving behind a cold, sterile dread. I watched Jasmine's shoulders, which were heaving just slightly, and then I watched her turn, pick up the single suitcase she'd brought into the foyer, and walk out the front door without another word. The click of the lock engaging was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was only then that I looked at David, expecting him to rush to me, to wrap his arms around me and condemn his wife's cruelty, to reassure me that I was his mother, his rock, the unshakable center of his world. That was our rhythm, the dance we had perfected over 3 decades. An outside force would press in, and we would retreat together, a fortress of two. He would be the comforting son, and I the steadfast mother. But he didn't move. He just stood there, his face pale and unreadable, his gaze following the door that had just closed. The air was thick with things unsaid, with years of Jasmine's frustrations that I had dismissed as youthful theatrics, with decades of my own carefully veiled manipulations that I had called love. I opened my mouth to speak, to say his name, to pull him back into our orbit, but the look on his face stopped me. It was a look I had never seen before. Not anger, not sadness, but a terrifying sort of clarity, as if the shattering of the window had allowed him to see outside for the first time. "David!" My voice was a fragile whisper, a sound I didn't recognize as my own. He finally turned his head, and his eyes, his beautiful brown eyes that were a mirror of my own, met mine. There was no comfort in them. There was no solidarity. There was only a profound, bottomless weariness. "She's right, Mom," he said, and each word was a careful, deliberate blow. "She's right about all of it." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet certainty of his statement did more damage than any scream ever could. He had not just failed to defend me. He had sided with my accuser. He had taken the stone she had thrown and used it to strike me himself. He picked up his car keys from the small dish by the door, the one I always kept polished for him. "I have to go," he said, his voice hollow. I have to go figure this out." And then he too walked out the door, leaving me alone in the wreckage of my life, the silence now a roaring, deafening monster. For 40 years since my husband Robert had passed away when David was just a boy, my entire existence had been a project, the raising and protecting of my son. I had convinced myself it was a noble, selfless calling. I was the lone matriarch, the strong black woman holding her family together, a fortress against the world's uncertainties. I had poured every ounce of my being into him. I managed his school projects, I vetted his friends, I critiqued his girlfriends with a fine-toothed comb, always finding a flaw that made them unworthy of my perfect boy. When he got his first real job at a downtown Atlanta firm, I helped him pick out his suits. When he bought his first car, I co-signed the loan just to be safe. Every major decision, every minor detail, had passed through my hands for approval. I called it guidance. I called it support. I had never, not for one single moment, called it control. His marriage to Jasmine had been the first real crack in my fortress. I had liked her initially. She was bright, ambitious, and seemed to adore David. But her adoration was different from mine. It was a love that encouraged independence, that saw a future for them that was separate from me. And that was a threat I couldn't abide. I began to resent the time they spent alone, the private jokes they shared, the way he would look at her with a light in his eyes that I had once believed was reserved only for me. My interventions became more frequent, my criticisms more pointed, always disguised as helpful suggestions. Jasmine, honey, that's a lot of spice in that dish. David has a sensitive stomach, or, are you sure you want to take that weekend trip? David has that big presentation on Monday. He really needs his rest. Every piece of advice was a little chisel, chipping away at their autonomy, designed to remind David that his mother always knew best. The ultimate test had come 2 weeks before Jasmine left. David had been offered a significant promotion, a director-level position at his company. It was everything he had worked for. The only catch was that the job was in Carson City, Nevada, a world away. When he told me, I felt a cold panic grip my chest, a physical sensation of loss so profound it stole my breath. I didn't forbid him from going. I was far too clever for that. Instead, I simply began to wilt. My appetite vanished. I spoke of my loneliness, of the creaks and groans of the big empty house, of a sudden dizzy spell I'd had at the grocery store. I never once said, "Don't go." I didn't have to. David, my beautifully trained, wonderfully loyal son, saw my frailty and did exactly what I had conditioned him to do. He turned down the promotion. He told his bosses that he couldn't move, that his family obligations in Atlanta were too important. He came over that evening and told me his decision, expecting, I think, to see relief and joy on my face. He saw relief, but it was my own selfish relief, not joy for him. I told him he was a good son, the best son a mother could ask for. I hugged him, feeling the solidness of him, the reassuring proximity, and I felt a smug sense of victory. I had won. I had kept my world intact. I saw Jasmine standing in the doorway behind him, her face a mask of disbelief that slowly hardened into a cold, diamond-hard fury. I had registered her expression, but I had dismissed it. In the ecosystem of my world, her feelings were a secondary concern. The bond between mother and son was primary, elemental, and everything else was just weather. I had no idea I was standing in the path of a hurricane. The days after they both left were a blur of suffocating silence. The house, once my sanctuary and my command center, became a prison. Every room echoed with their absence. I'd walk past David's old bedroom and feel a pang of such acute loss it was like a physical blow. I'd see the indentation on the sofa where Jasmine used to sit, rolling her eyes ever so slightly at something I'd said, and I'd feel a spike of rage, followed by a wave of desolate emptiness. At first, all I could feel was the sting of betrayal. How could they do this to me? After everything I had sacrificed, everything I had done for them, I had given David my entire life, and he had chosen her. He had chosen a woman who had insulted me in my own home and walked away. The injustice of it all burned in my gut, a constant acidic fire. I replayed Jasmine's words over and over in my head. A vine choking the life out of him. The image was ugly, parasitic. It was a monstrous distortion of what I knew to be love. I spent the first week waiting for the phone to ring. I was certain David would come to his senses. He would realize his mistake, break down, and beg for my forgiveness. He would come home. But the phone remained silent. I tried calling him, but my calls went straight to voicemail. His voice on the recording, so cheerful and familiar, was a special kind of torture. I left messages, at first angry, then pleading, then just weeping into the receiver. Each unanswered call was another confirmation that the world as I knew it had ended. I was adrift, untethered from the one person who had given my life meaning and purpose. I was Marjorie Carter, David's mother. Without him, who was I? The answer, it seemed, was a lonely old woman who ate canned soup over the sink and cried herself to sleep at night. The second week was worse than the first. The anger began to curdle into a thick, heavy despair. The house started to feel neglected. A thin layer of dust settled on the furniture I no longer had the energy to polish. The vibrant green ferns in the sunroom began to droop, their leaves turning a sickly yellow because I had forgotten to water them. They were dying, and the symbolism was not lost on me. I felt like I was dying too, wilting from the inside out, deprived of the sun that had been my light and my water for so long. It was during that second week that I received a plain white envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a printout of a flight confirmation. David Carter. One way. Atlanta to Reno. The flight had departed 3 days ago. He had gone. He had taken the job. He had moved to Carson City without so much as a goodbye. He had left me. The sight of that flight confirmation did something strange to me. I had expected to feel a fresh wave of grief, a final crushing blow. And I did for a moment. But underneath it was something else, something sharp and cold and startlingly clear. It was the finality of it. He was gone. He wasn't just across town, angry and ignoring my calls. He was 2,000 miles away, starting a new life, a life that he had chosen, a life that did not include me. The umbilical cord, the one I had refused to cut for 30 years, had not been severed. It had been ripped away. The pain was excruciating, but for the first time, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of space around me. The air in the room seemed thinner, easier to breathe. That night I couldn't sleep. I wandered through the silent house, my hand trailing along the walls, over the framed photos of David at every stage of his life. David on his first day of school, his little hand clutched tightly in mine. David at his high school graduation, me beaming at his side. David and Jasmine on their wedding day, me standing just a little too close to them in the official portrait, my hand possessively on my son's arm. I looked at that photo for a long, long time. I saw the strained smile on Jasmine's face. I saw the slightly helpless look in David's eyes as he was caught between his new wife and his mother. And I saw myself, my expression one of triumphant ownership. I wasn't just the mother of the groom. I was the main character, and this was just another scene in the story of my devotion to my son. A vine, Jasmine had said. For the first time, I didn't push the image away. I let it take root in my mind. I thought about how a vine grows. It seeks support, something strong to cling to. It wraps itself around its host slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. It can be beautiful, its leaves lush and green. But as it grows, it tightens its grip. It blocks the sun, consumes the resources. It suffocates the very thing that gives it life. And I, Marjorie Carter, had been the most magnificent, the most tenacious, the most loving and beautiful and destructive vine that had ever grown. The realization didn't come like a lightning bolt. It seeped in slowly, a cold and bitter truth that settled deep in my bones. I had not been protecting David. I had been possessing him. I had not been supporting him. I had been stunting his growth. My love wasn't a fortress, it was a cage. A beautifully decorated, comfortable cage, but a cage nonetheless. And Jasmine hadn't just been trying to save herself. She had been trying to save him too. The grief I felt then was a different kind of grief. It was no longer the grief of the victim, the abandoned mother. It was the grief of the perpetrator, the dawning, horrifying shame of someone who has caused immense harm out of what she truly believed was love. I collapsed onto the floor. Right there in the hallway, surrounded by the smiling faces of the boy I had failed, and I wept. I wept for the man I had prevented my son from becoming. I wept for the wife I had tormented. And for the first time, I wept for myself, for the woman I might have been if I had not poured my entire identity into the vessel of my child. The next morning, I woke up on the floor with a stiff neck and a startlingly empty mind. The roaring monster of silence had receded, leaving behind a quiet hum. It was the hum of a house at rest. It was the hum of possibility. I stood up, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I looked around my house not as a museum of my past, but as a space that belonged only to me. I walked into the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee. I didn't think about whether David would have wanted a cup. I just made it for myself. I sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the backyard, at the overgrown rose bushes I had neglected. I decided right then and there that I would prune them. Not tomorrow, but today. That small decision felt monumental. It was the first choice I had made in years that was entirely for my own benefit, with no ulterior motive related to my son. I spent the entire day in the garden, my hands raw from the thorns and the dirt. I cut back the dead wood with a ruthless precision, trimming the bushes back to their essential healthy core. It was hard, sweaty work, and it felt wonderful. As I worked, I thought about my life. I had retired from my job as an administrative manager at a logistics company 5 years ago, right when David and Jasmine got married. I had told everyone it was to enjoy my golden years, but the truth was, I wanted to be more available to help the newlyweds. My days had revolved around David's schedule. Now my days were a blank canvas. The thought was no longer terrifying. It was interesting. A few days later, while cleaning out a closet filled with old paperwork and memorabilia from my past life, I found a box of old photographs from my time at the company. I saw pictures from office parties and team-building retreats. I saw faces I hadn't thought of in years. And then I saw him. Charles Henderson. He had been a manager in the operations department. A kind, quiet man with a warm smile and a laugh that could fill a room. We had been work friends, always friendly, always professional. He was a widower, and we had sometimes shared a quiet lunch in the break room, talking about our children and the quiet ache of missing a spouse. There was a photo of the two of us at a retirement party for a colleague. We were standing next to each other, smiling for the camera, a comfortable, easy distance between us. I remembered that day. I remembered thinking he was a good man. On a whim, a strange impulse I couldn't explain, I looked him up online. It wasn't hard to find him. He was still in Atlanta. He was listed as a volunteer at the local botanical gardens. The same botanical gardens where I had just spent a day wrestling with my overgrown roses. The coincidence felt like a small nudge from the universe. I stared at his phone number for a full 20 minutes, my heart hammering in my chest. What was I doing? I was a 70-year-old woman whose life had just imploded. I was a mother who had driven her son 2,000 miles away. What business did I have calling an old coworker? But the alternative was sitting alone in my silent house, and I was suddenly fiercely tired of being alone. I took a deep breath and dialed the number. When he answered, his voice was just as I remembered it, calm and warm. Charles Henderson speaking. I almost hung up. My throat was dry. Charles, I said, my voice cracking slightly. It's Marjorie Carter. We used to work together at Atlantic Logistics. There was a pause, and for a mortifying second I thought he wouldn't remember me. Then a slow rumbling chuckle came down the line. Marjorie Carter. Well, I'll be. Of course I remember you. The only person who could keep that office from descending into chaos. How have you been? It must be, 5 years? His easy warmth disarmed me. I found myself talking, the words spilling out of me, not about David and Jasmine, not about the implosion of my life, but about retirement, about gardening, about the strange quiet of the days. I told him I'd seen he was volunteering at the botanical gardens. I'm a member there, he said. You should come by sometime. The dahlias are in full bloom. They're really something to see, so I did. The next Saturday, I put on a dress I hadn't worn in years, a floral print that felt cheerful and optimistic. I drove to the gardens, feeling a nervous flutter that was completely unfamiliar. I found him near the dahlia exhibit, patiently explaining the difference between a collarette and a water lily dahlia to a small group of visitors. He saw me and his face broke into that same warm smile from the photograph. We spent the rest of the afternoon walking through the gardens, and I talked. I told him everything. I didn't plan to, but in the peaceful, beautiful surroundings, with this kind man listening patiently, the whole sordid, shameful story just came pouring out. I told him about my devotion to David, about my resentment of Jasmine, about the promotion, about the fight, about the silence. I told him about the vine. I expected him to recoil, to look at me with judgment or pity. But he didn't. He just listened, nodding occasionally. When I was finished, my voice hoarse and my eyes wet with tears, I hadn't realized I was crying. He was quiet for a long moment. We stood by the Japanese garden, watching the koi swim in lazy circles in the pond. Love is a powerful thing, Marjorie, he finally said, his voice gentle. Sometimes it's so powerful it gets tangled up and we can't tell the difference between holding on and strangling. He looked at me, his eyes full of a deep, compassionate understanding. You see what you did? That's a hard thing to see. A lot of people go their whole lives never seeing it. The question is, what are you going to do now? His words clarified everything. He didn't absolve me, but he didn't condemn me either. He simply presented me with a choice. I could wallow in my shame and my loneliness, or I could do something about it. I had spent my life trying to control my son's life. It was time to take control of my own. That conversation with Charles was the beginning of my real transformation. It wasn't about winning David back. It was about becoming a person who was worthy of his love, not as a possession, but as a gift freely given. It was about becoming a person I could respect. My plan, as it formed, had nothing to do with revenge or manipulation. It was a plan for reconstruction. My own. I started small. I joined a water aerobics class at the local community center. I, who had always hated public pools, found a strange joy in the camaraderie of the other women, our aging bodies bobbing and stretching in the warm water. I started volunteering at the library, reshelving books, the quiet, orderly task a soothing balm for my chaotic mind. I had Charles over for dinner. I cooked for him, and for the first time I didn't worry if the food was seasoned to someone else's preference. I cooked what I liked, and he seemed to like it too. We talked for hours about our pasts, our late spouses, our hopes for the future we had left. It was easy. It was comfortable. It was a kind of companionship I had forgotten could exist. But the biggest part of my plan, the hardest part, involved David. After 2 months of silence, 2 months of working on myself, I knew I was ready. I couldn't call him. A phone call was too easy to ignore, too easy to misinterpret. I had to write a letter. I sat down at my desk with a pen and a piece of my best stationery, and I wrote. I didn't make excuses. I didn't ask for pity. I simply apologized. I wrote, "Dear David, I am writing to you today to say I am sorry. I have spent the last 2 months thinking about the things Jasmine said, and the things you said, and I have come to realize that you were both right. My love for you became a cage, and I am so profoundly sorry for the pain my selfishness has caused both of you. I understand why you had to leave, and I want you to know that I see now that it was the bravest thing you could have done. I hope that one day you will be able to forgive me, but whether you do or not, I want you to be happy. Live your life. Be free. I love you." Mom, I wrote a separate letter to Jasmine. It was even harder to write. "Dear Jasmine," I began. "There are no words to properly express how sorry I am for the way I have treated you for the past 5 years. You came into our family with an open heart, and I met you with suspicion and jealousy. You deserved a mother-in-law who would welcome you, and instead you got a rival. The things you said before you left were true, and I thank you for your honesty, however painful it was to hear. It was a wake-up call I desperately needed. I wish you and David nothing but a lifetime of happiness together, a happiness that you can build on your own terms. Sincerely, Marjorie." Mailing those letters was one of the scariest things I have ever done. I dropped them in the blue mailbox on the corner and felt a wave of nausea. I had laid my heart bare, with no guarantee of how it would be received. I had relinquished all control. For the next week I was a nervous wreck. Every time the phone rang, I jumped. Every car that drove down my street made me peek through the curtains. But nothing happened. The silence from Carson City continued. Charles was my rock during that time. "You did the right thing, Marjorie," he told me over coffee. "You can't control how they'll react. You can only control your own actions. You did the honest, honorable thing. Now you have to let it go and keep living your own life." He was right. I forced myself to focus on my new routine. Water aerobics. The library. Dinners with Charles. I started to feel a sense of peace settle over me. I had done what I could. The rest was up to them. I was beginning to accept that our relationship might be broken forever, and while the thought was still painful, it no longer felt like the end of the world. My world was bigger now. Contained more than just my son. It contained new friends, new interests, and the quiet, steady presence of a good man. Then one Tuesday evening, about 2 weeks after I had sent the letters, my phone rang. The caller ID said David. My hand trembled as I answered. "Hello," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Mom." It was him. He sounded hesitant, cautious. "Hi, David," I managed to say, my heart feeling like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. There was a long pause. I got your letter," he said. "Jasmine got hers too." I held my breath, waiting for the verdict. We've been talking about it a lot, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. It was a lot to take in. Ma, I want to believe you mean it. I do, David, I said, tears streaming down my face now. Every word. I see it now. I see what I was doing, and I am so ashamed we talked for over an hour that night. It wasn't an easy conversation. There were tears and long, awkward silences. He told me how hard it had been for him, feeling torn between the two most important women in his life. He told me how liberating it felt to be in Carson City, to be making his own decisions, to be his own man. He was thriving at his new job. Jasmine was happy. They were building a life. And as he spoke, I didn't feel the old sting of jealousy. I felt a swell of pride. My son was happy. He was becoming the man he was always meant to be. That first phone call was followed by another, and then another. We started talking once a week. The conversations became easier, lighter. He told me about his projects at work. I told him about my water aerobics class and my disastrous attempt at baking a sourdough loaf. I told him about Charles. He was quiet for a moment when I mentioned Charles's name. Is he a nice guy? He asked, a note of his old protectiveness in his voice. He's a very nice guy, David, I said, smiling. And he lets me be me. I think he understood what I meant. The real test came about 6 months after the letters. David called and said that he and Jasmine were thinking of coming to Atlanta for Thanksgiving. We'd like to see you, Mom, he said. If you're up for it, the fear was immediate. What if I reverted to my old ways? What if the fragile truce we had built shattered under the pressure of a face-to-face meeting? I took a deep breath. I would love that, David, I said. And I'd like it very much if you would both have Thanksgiving dinner here. With me and Charles it was a bold move, but it felt right. This was my new life. They needed to see it. When I opened the door on Thanksgiving Day, they looked different. They looked relaxed, happy. They stood together as a unit, their hands intertwined. Jasmine looked at me, a cautious but genuine smile on her face. Hello, Marjorie, she said. It's good to see you. There was no animosity in her voice, only a quiet grace. David hugged me, a real warm hug, not the obligatory peck on the cheek I had become used to. Hi, Mom, he said. Charles was there, a steady, reassuring presence at my side. He shook David's hand firmly and gave Jasmine a warm smile. The four of us stood in the foyer, the same foyer where my life had fallen apart less than a year ago, and the air was not tense, but filled with a fragile, hopeful peace. The day was not perfect. There were moments of awkwardness, lulls in the conversation where the ghosts of our past seemed to hover in the room. But we pushed through them. I made a conscious effort to direct my questions to both of them, not just to David. I asked Jasmine about her new job as a graphic designer. I listened, truly listened, as she talked about her projects with passion and excitement. I saw the way David looked at her, with such pride and love, and I felt a genuine, uncomplicated happiness for them both. I didn't offer a single piece of unsolicited advice. I didn't critique the way Jasmine was cutting the turkey. I didn't mention that David looked a little tired. I just let them be. And I let myself be. The most telling moment came after dinner. David and I were in the kitchen alone, clearing the plates. He was quiet for a few minutes and then he said, "You seem different, Mom." Happy, I smiled, rinsing a plate under the warm water. I am happy, David. He leaned against the counter, looking at me with a new kind of respect. Charles is a good man, he said. I'm glad you have him. It wasn't a son giving his mother permission. It was one adult acknowledging the happiness of another. It was the moment I knew we had truly turned a corner. Before they left to go back to their hotel, Jasmine approached me. She stood before me, her expression serious. Marjorie, she said, I want to thank you for the letter and for today. It couldn't have been easy, I shook my head. Jasmine, you have nothing to thank me for. It is I who should be thanking you. You gave me back my son. And you gave me back myself. We looked at each other, and for the first time, I saw her not as a threat, but as a strong, honest woman who had fought for her marriage and in doing so, had inadvertently saved me from myself. In a gesture that stunned me, she reached out and gave me a brief, warm hug. "I'm glad we could do this," she whispered. Watching them leave, I didn't feel the old panic, the desperate sense of loss. I felt a quiet contentment. My son was a man, happy and in love, living his own life. And I was a woman, happy and in love, living mine. The vine had been untangled. The cage door was open. And I was at long last free. My life today is fuller and richer than I ever could have imagined in my old narrow world. Charles and I are inseparable. We travel, we garden, we spend our evenings reading side by side or debating politics. My relationship with David and Jasmine is better than it has ever been. We talk on the phone, we visit, but our lives are our own. The love between us is no longer an obligation or a possession. It is a choice made freely and with mutual respect. I had to lose my son to finally learn how to be a mother. I had to have my world destroyed to find out how to build a life. It was a brutal, painful lesson, but it was the one that saved me. The silence in my house is no longer a monster. It's just peace. What would you do in this person's place? Would you have had the strength to look at your own faults and apologize so completely? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. It's always so interesting to hear different perspectives. And please write me where you heard this story. I love knowing how far these experiences travel. If this story touched your heart, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to my channel. There are many other stories waiting for you, each one a journey of the human spirit. Your support, whether through a subscription or a super thanks donation, helps me to continue bringing these important narratives to light. With heartfelt greetings. Until next time.